All right, hey guys, I'm Ned Williams, interviewing Dan Schneider for the Vincetti brothers, which I think it's now been 5 days since I completed it.
Ah.
5 days. Of course, tumbleweeds comes before that. I don't think we talked too much about tumbleweeds before, but let's just go right into Vincetti brothers. Real quick, maybe it doesn't even matter, but when did you wrote this in 2010?
2011. Tumbleweeds I wrote in 2005, and it was a standalone book. Then I thought, well, I wanted to write, I had always wanted to write about these three brothers that I actually knew, the brothers that became Gino, Aldo, and Dino. In real life, there were only three brothers, but for this book, I made it seven, but focused on three. And then when I got to the end of the Vincetti brothers, because I had these other two great characters that came out of nowhere, Big Frank Concetto and the Norwegian, I decided, well, I have to go and do something with that. And there came, well, I must make a trilogy. And then by the time I got to the end of that, I said, well, let me do a fourth book called 64, which wraps up some of the storylines. So what originally was a standalone novel in terms of Tumbleweeds, which was sort of a fictive version of my four true life books condensed into one, itself became a quartet. And this is the second of those four books.
All right, the second of the four books. Yeah, so let me see. My first question. I see you at the very beginning of the book. I mentioned you this, and I mentioned you this in the email. At the very beginning of the book, you say this is what the book is. I'm not going to talk too much about the two older brothers, about Rocco and Tony. I'm not going to do that. But by the very end of the book, you decide, well, I guess I have to do that. And the cool thing is I mentioned that you actually talk about that. You're like, I told you at the beginning, I'm not going to talk about them too much, but you ended up doing that. And so I'm starting to wonder, how else did the book change between writing it? I'm sure it wasn't just, you mentioned Frank and the Norwegian, but was there other moments too where you just had a creative burst and decided to go with it?
Well, I mean, the Big Frank and the Norwegian chapters were the biggest ones. These characters just popped out because, and I'm sure there were smaller things, but something like, talking more about the brother, I think it's Antonio, who's the priest who gets caught up in a pedophilia scandal, although it's basically off stage. And then there's the older brother whose name I forget, who ends up being Rocco. He becomes an ex-con. And then there's two twins that are the youngest of the seven brothers, and they're the least talked about. But yeah, Big Frank and the Norwegian were the characters that popped out. And the reason they did pop out was because you'll see as you read, get to a Norwegian in the family, I make great use of real life celebrity cameos in the book. I do a little bit of that here. For example, the Norwegian chapter, a good portion of that is his meeting with a guy called Richard the Iceman Kuklinski, who was a real mafia hitman.
Yeah.
And sort of the Norwegians dick waving towards him. But I'm sure that there are, as I just mentioned, because I wrote this in 2011, which is now over a decade since writing it. I can look at it with the distance and objectivity of not having written it. Of course, I do remember certain things. If I were reading certain passages, I say, "Oh, that's that. Yeah, that." For example, and I had wanted to write about these three real life brothers for 20 some years, and when I was writing just poetry, I thought, should I do a long poem and sort of a modern epopee with one of the brothers, sort of an Odysseus-like character, and that didn't seem to be good. And then I thought of, after I did True Life, that I think there's a slight mention of some characters there that are minor characters that were also based on the real life Vincetti brothers. And I thought, well, should I do a memoir of them? I said, no, no, no. So then I did True Life, and I think I've sent you probably virtually all my books, so you're reading these, I guess, first. And you'll see how I think this Vincetti Brothers is, like my 28th book at the time, and now including plays, I'm up to like 168 or something.
Jesus.
But it's one of those things where you just the things come to you, and that's one of the things that too often does not happen. I think I mentioned in an interview I did with this British fellow, Ethan Pinch, that I had once came across a woman that I had liked and who almost got involved with, and I saw she was doing one of these typical kind of things where on her wall she would have post-its and she'd make a timeline of it, and it was an absurd sort of modernist take on making Moby Dick sort of like an LGBT tale, although it didn't have a whale or anything, and it was just ridiculous. And she would have these all the and everything was so defined that there was no room for the give and take of things that happen in life. And I was just thinking about free will. I was just arguing online as I was listening to some of this Johnny Depp Amber Heard bullshit trial, and I was arguing with this fellow
Yeah.
about free will, and I art is probably the greatest example for the reality of free will that you can come up with, because if you had taken my life even up to just say a day or two before I put the first words down to the Vincetti brothers, and I push it out 6 months, this book would not be the same. There would be no Vincetti brothers without everything I have. It is 100% my free-willed. It's imprinted, and I created it. There is no way that dominoes falling this way or that way is going to produce the Vincetti brothers, or a great symphony, or Moby Dick, or a great film like Citizen Kane, or any Stanley Kubrick film you can think of. All of these things are things that are essentially part of that person, and you will it, you bend things to it. And I've had this argument with many people, and I don't want to get into the free will argument here, but art is without a doubt the single, even more so than science, because as I think I might have said in one of these things, it might have been with you, is science in a sense is inevitable. Someone would have discovered quantum physics. Someone will have discovered the theory of relativity. Someone would have invented the wheel if the person who didn't do it did not do it. But no one in an infinity minus one replays of this universe from the supposed Big Bang, or if it is eternal, no one would have ever written Moby Dick without Melville at that time, at that moment. And the same thing goes for me at this time, a decade or so ago, in writing the Vincetti brothers. It just cannot happen.